The geologic record, does it prove a young or an old Earth? Let's begin with this question. Which one is real science? The data must conform to the theory. If it does not, adjust or ignore the data. Or the theory must conform to the data. If it does not, adjust or abandon the theory. I think we'd all agree the second one is real science. One of the assumptions upon which evolution is based is an idea called uniformitarianism, and it is a belief that all processes have worked the way they do now, gradually over a long period of time, instead of in compressed periods. Here's an example of uniformitarianist thinking. This man is walking at 3 miles per hour. His house is 60 miles away. The uniformitarianist conclusion, therefore, he has been walking for 20 hours. But uniformitarianism fails to consider very real possibilities that would affect the outcome or the conclusion. Did he come from his house? Did he run some of the way? Did he hitchhike part of the distance? Did he stop and rest along the way? Is he tired now and walking at a different speed? So you can see that uniformitarianist thinking does not consider factors that could very much influence the outcome of an accurate conclusion. One of the assumptions upon which creationism is based is called catastrophism, and it is the belief that gradual processes have been interrupted by the effects of huge natural catastrophes. Evolutionists say they don't believe in catastrophism, but they actually admit that there have been multiple catastrophes. If you look up extinction events, you see that the estimate of the number of major mass extinctions in the last 540 million year range from as few as 5 to more than 20. So the bottom line is they do believe in catastrophes. It just seems that they don't want to admit that the flood of Noah could have been one of those. Some people try to combine evolution and creation in their minds, but that really cannot work. On the question of when life began, evolution asserts that life began 3.7 billion years ago. Creation, on the other hand, would say that life began 6,000 to 6,500 years ago. On the issue of when humans began, evolutionists would say about 2 million years ago, whereas creationists would say, again, 6,000 to 6,500 years ago. Now, science is supposed to be observable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable. Most creationists would be honest enough to admit that creation is not observable. It happened in the past. It's not testable. There's really nothing we can do to test it directly. It's not repeatable because we mortals can't create, but we can falsify. We can check it against known data. If evolutionists were equally honest, they would also admit that evolution is not observable. It also happened in the past. It's not testable. It's not repeatable, because if evolution happened, it was in the very distant past or is happening so slowly that we cannot observe it. But we can falsify it by checking it against the known data. That's what we intend to do. A very famous science philosopher by the name of Karl Popper stated, "The central idea of falsifiability is that a scientific theory can never be proven true. Instead, science progresses by developing theories that are testable and can be disproven or falsified by the evidence." How does this work? If I have a theory that all swans are white, seeing lots of swans that are white does not prove my theory. It just means that the data is consistent with my theory. Finding more swans still doesn't prove the theory. It's only consistent with the theory. But finding one single swan of another color is sufficient to disprove my theory that all swans are white. Another thing Karl Popper said is, one contrary observation is often sufficient to falsify a theory. We're going to see several in this video. One of the assertions I make is that evolution and creation both are religious beliefs, but which one fits the data best? So let's examine, what does the geologic record really show? When I was a junior in high school in the 1960s, This idea of Earth's continents once fitting together in the past was not accepted by geological community. Now, sonar was put into use in a major way in World War II to detect submarines. And after the war, sonar was used in science to map the ocean floor. And they found something they did not anticipate, something very strange. There were rifts in the ocean floor showing that it was splitting apart, and places where the ocean floor had subducted under continents. They found these spreading ridges under all the world's oceans. What they realized was happening was that magma pushes up in cracks in the ocean floors from underneath and creates new ocean floor. It creates a mid-ocean ridge, and the new ocean floor pushes out from the ridge. These floors spread slowly away from the ridge until they get subducted under continental plates. This gave rise to a new science of plate tectonics. The Earth's crust is broken into several plates that float on the Earth's liquid magma underneath. Plate tectonics was not accepted in mainstream geology until the late 1960s or 70s. So it turns out that all the continents were at one time one big megacontinent, which now geologists call Pangea. What could possibly have initiated the split up of Pangea? Whatever it would have been catastrophic for sure. I propose it happened during the flood of Noah. More about that in my video on Noah's flood. So here are some mainstream geologic ideas that don't fit. The prevailing idea is that dinosaurs lived roughly from 240 million years ago until about 64 million years ago. What caused their distinction? There are many theories. Some, but not all evolutionists believe that the Earth was hit by an asteroid. They believe that this asteroid caused the extinction of the dinosaurs by creating a huge cloud of dust that changed the climate suddenly and caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. This is a catastrophic mass extinction event. Therefore, uniformitarianism principles should not be used to date layers, but uniformitarians ignore this inconsistency. Those evolutionists who hold to the idea of the asteroid-caused extinction of the dinosaurs believe it struck just off the coast of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Look where the circle goes over the land. I'm going to take away the red circle, but look where it goes, and you will see that there is a ridge, a crease in the land. It's still visible by satellite. So it does seem that an asteroid impact did indeed take place there. The problem is it was not big enough to cause global extinction. Why does mainstream science oppose catastrophism when they believe and teach that there have been repeated worldwide extinction level events? Evolutionists do not really believe that there have never been any catastrophes. In fact, that they admit that there have been at least 5. They just don't want to admit the flood of Noah. Is 5 mass extinctions consistent with uniformitarianism? Obviously not. This is one of those fallacies of logic. It's called cherry picking, when only evidence that furthers an argument is presented and evidence that would go against the argument is withheld. Which brings us back to our first question. Which one is real science? The data must conform to the theory. If it does not, adjust or ignore the data, or the theory must conform to the data. If it does not, adjust or abandon the theory. So, what does the geologic record really show? Evolutionists proclaim that the Grand Canyon is the showcase of the geologic table, and it is. The canyon layers are made up of layers called megasequences, also known as cratonic sequences. These are not local geologic layers. Look at the bottom layer, the Salk megasequence shown here in brown. It extends to a significant portion of North America. The Tippecanoe megasequence on top of that also extends to a significant portion of North America. And the Kaskaskia megasequence on top of that. And the Absaroka megasequence on top of that. And finally, the Zuni megasequence on top of that. All of these megasequences come from some mega cause. because there is nothing in traditional geology or their standard explanations of the creation of these layers that would explain sequences that are that big. Only continental-sized tsunamis could lay down continental megasequence layers like that. That's something we haven't seen in the last several thousand years. Nothing in traditional geology explains this. But because a thing is not happening now, uniformitarians ignore what is right in front of their eyes, that these megasequences are continental in scope. But the flood of Noah explains this perfectly. So, which is more credible? Continent-sized strata are put down by gradual processes over millennia in flat layers, but only by local flooding events? Or continent-sized strata are put down in quick succession in even layers by continent-sized tsunamis? Next, we'll delve into the idea that those megasequences were laid down quickly. How could megasequences be formed? Many school kids have done an experiment where they take a bunch of dirt, put it in a jar, then add water and shake it up. The particles sort themselves out, with the coarsest ones at the bottom, fine ones in the middle, and the very finest at the top. In nature, this is known as graded bedding, and it happens in avalanches, tidal deposits, pyroclastic flows, flood deposits, and tsunami deposits. There are lots of examples in our rocks of graded bedding. A typical sequence in graded bedding is that on the bottom you'll have the coarsest particles, which make up sandstone. On top of that, you have finer particles, which make up shale. And on the top of that, you have limestone, which is the very finest. Graded bedding only happens in aquatic processes, not in dry land processes. And it does not happen gradually or one layer at a time. It only happens in sets, coarsest to finest, and it happens all at once. And sets may repeat. Mainstream geology claims that these megasequences were created gradually over hundreds of millions of years, but that isn't what the rocks tell us. Each of the megasequences is a giant graded bed. Graded beds have not been seen being made this big in modern times. They don't fit mainstream geology's narrative of being laid down over many millions of years. Sequences are aquatic deposits, but aquatic deposits this big in historical times have never been seen. That's why they're called mega sequences. But they fit what happened in the flood of Noah exactly. Please note that the Sauk megasequence, starting at the bottom, is sandstone, shale, and limestone. The Tippecanoe megasequence on top of that is sandstone, shale, and limestone. The Kaskaskia megasequence on top of that is sandstone, shale, and limestone. The Absaroka megasequence is a little different. Sandstone, then mixed sediment, then limestone on the top. And finally, the Zuni megasequence is sandstone, shale, and limestone. These are sequences just like all other sequences. Which one is more credible? Continent-sized megasequences show graded bedding, but formed slowly over many hundreds of millions of years. Or continent-sized megasequences show graded bedding because they form quickly over days or months. We are told that the strata of the Grand Canyon were laid down slowly over many hundreds of millions of years by natural, mostly local processes. We saw previously that the megasequences found in the Grand Canyon were continent-wide, but that isn't where they end. The Sauk megasequence was at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and it extends to most of North America, but the same sequence also is found in South America and also in Africa. The next sequence in the Grand Canyon is the Tippecanoe cratonic sequence. It too extended to most of North America also. But the same sequence is also found in South America and in Africa. And the third megasequence, Kaskaskia, and like the two previous, it extends to a lot of North America. But the same sequence is also found in South America and also in Africa. If this doesn't validate the idea of a global flood, what will? So which is more credible? Strata in the Grand Canyon accumulated local over many millions of years, or Grand Canyon strata are the same as found all over the world in the same order because they were laid down in the same global flood. Column 1 is mainstream geology's standard names for different strata. Column 2 is also terminology from mainstream geology, but refers to the cratonic sequences or megasequences found in the Grand Canyon. Below those megasequences is a dividing line called the Great Unconformity. That bottom layer is basically pre-flood deposits. More about that in my video on fossils. Starting at the Sauk megasequence, we find simpler fossils. These were laid down at the beginning of the flood. The Tippecanoe megasequence is still early in the flood and deposits deep ocean creatures that became fossils. The Kaskaskia megasequence is intermediate flood activity with mixed land and marine creatures in the fossil record. The Absaroka megasequence shows lots of land animals as fossils, and the Zuni megasequence shows the last of the land animals as fossils. There is something in the geologic record called the Morrison Formation. It is a layer of dinosaur fossils. It's in the Zuni megasequence, and it is huge, over 600,000 square miles. That's much too big for any cataclysm short of a global flood, with continent-sized tsunamis. Even though it extends over the area shown on the map in many places, it is covered over by more recent deposits and not accessible to paleontologists. Part of the Morrison Formation is a dinosaur boneyard called the Hells Creek Formation. Interestingly, it has T-Rex and shark teeth in the same matrix. Normal geology ignores this because they can't explain it, but the worldwide flood by gigantic tsunamis explains it perfectly, as well as all of the other megasequences. The Tejas layer is the post-flood deposits from volcanic action, earthquakes, mountains rising, and the resultant erosion. One important takeaway is that each of the 5 cratonic sequences or megasequences were laid down at one time, and each one was created by water. Nothing like it has happened in historical times, and so mainstream geology can't seem to admit this. Why? Because mainstream geology is dead set against even admitting the possibility of a global flood, even though the evidence is all around them. The Tejas layer was laid down after the flood by various processes and is not a sequence. So which is more credible? Geologic column is a billion-year history of Earth by gradual processes in spite of continent-sized deposits and inconsistent fossils. Or the geologic column was laid down in quick succession as water deposited sequences during the flood by continental tsunamis. To get our bearings of the different time frames we're talking about, most creationist scientists believe that the flood took place about 4,500 years ago. This is the difference between 4,500 years and just 1 million years. Look at the proposed ages of these megasequences according to mainstream geology. The Sauk, 500 to 600 million years ago. Tippecanoe, 408 to 500 million years ago. Kaskaskia, 320 to 408 million years ago. Absaroka, 190 to 320 million years ago. And the Zuni, 50 to 190 million years ago. Those are huge time frames. And consider the thicknesses of these layers. The Sauk is 900 to 1,500 feet thick. Tippecanoe is usually over 200 feet thick. The Kaskaskia is 500 to 800 feet thick. The Absaroka is 2,300 to 2,900 feet thick. And the Zuni is 0 to 200 feet thick, depending on how much erosion has taken it away. Overall, we have 3,900 to 5,600 feet of sediment. Look at the top layer of this Grand Canyon. It's eroded. Look at those vertical grooves caused by watercourses in one of the driest areas in North America. But the other layers underneath that, supposedly hundreds of millions of years in difference, are flat with no erosion evident. Look at the top layer again, eroded. But other layers, supposedly separated by hundreds of millions of years, are different. They are flat. No evidence of any erosion, except in the top layer. Can mainstream geology seriously propose that there was zero erosion in 100 years, let alone in 1,000 years, or 1,000,000 years, but hundreds of millions of years? Really? Erosion happens on Earth even in a desert climate. And even in desert, rain happens occasionally, and the lack of vegetation allows for even more erosion than in wetter and highly vegetated areas. Soil and rocks are all subject to erosion, and erosion happens everywhere on Earth all the time. Again, look at the top layer of the Grand Canyon. Erosion everywhere, even in the driest zone of North America. There are signs everywhere showing watercourses and the grooves they make in the vertical contour of the top layer. Every one of those arrows points to a place where the vertical plane would be changed if viewed from the side, but not one bit of erosion in any of the layers underneath. Again, look at the top layer of the Grand Canyon. See the vertical contour of the top layer. It's eroded. Now compare the top layer with the other layers, supposedly hundreds of millions of years. Flat. What little deviation from flat lines is from the edges in and out, rather than from up and down. How come only the top layer shows any erosion? Anywhere you look in the Grand Canyon, not just the main divisions, but all those subdivisions too. How come only the top layer shows any erosion? You don't have to be a scientist to see the inconsistency of this. All you need is a logical, open mind. It's not just little grooves from watercourses, whole layers have eroded through. It's so obvious. Why don't the geologists come clean and admit that their model of hundreds of millions of years for these big layers just isn't logical or viable? Which is more credible? Except for the top layer, no Grand Canyon strata shows any sign of any erosion, but are hundreds of millions of years old anyway. Or, except for the top layer, Grand Canyon strata show no erosion because they were laid down in quick succession about 4,500 years ago. This phenomena of strata upon strata without erosion doesn't just happen in the Grand Canyon. Everywhere, all over the earth, we see strata upon strata, but we see little evidence of any erosion. Hengifoss, the third largest waterfall in Iceland, note the erosion all over the top surface and beyond that, the carving of the stream's channel. But the layers that make up the canyon's sides show no erosion. They're flat, not even an incline like the top layer. Although top layers show erosion and streams carve channels, but underneath that, all layers typically show no erosion and are remarkably uniform. Strata all over the world show layers with no erosion. Obviously, they were laid down quickly before erosion could shape them individually. Then, since that time, erosion has cut through the multiple flat layers. This happens all over the world because the flood of Noah was a global event. Looking up at an angle, layers look varied due to the in and out of the side edge, but looking straight from the side, these layers are flat and uniform, with little or no erosion over supposedly hundreds of years minimum, up to thousands or millions of years for each layer. No erosion evident anywhere. In most places, you can't drive down the highway without seeing layers like this. It's the same all over the world, all without erosion. This means that these layers are not millions of years old, but laid down quickly, as in the global flood of Noah. Look at the line between the red and the white layers. You don't have to be a scientist. You just have to be able to think logically. There's not 100 years of erosion evidence, not 1,000 years of erosion, not 1,000,000. Can you seriously be expected to believe that they are separated by hundreds of millions of years? Sometimes we see new layers slice off previous layers as a group, but still no individual layer erosion. all of that indicates rapid laydown of layers, not over hundreds, thousands, or millions of years, but weeks or days, as we believed happened during the flood of Noah. And again, traditional geology has no answer for anomalies like this. Why are there 140 to 160 million years of missing strata, but no signs of erosion at the same time? The traditional model of geology just doesn't make sense. It's not a question of lack of scientific knowledge, it's a question of lack of common sense. Almost everywhere you look, you see flat sediments with no erosion. Therefore, they can't be hundreds or thousands of years old, let alone millions of years. So which is more credible? Except for the top layers, strata all over the Earth show no sign of any erosion, but are hundreds of millions of years old anyway. Or, except for the top layer, strata all over the Earth show no sign of any erosion. They were laid down together about 4,500 years ago. This is how the Egyptians raised an obelisk, and an obelisks were long tapered pieces of solid rock. Moving and mounting a stone obelisk was tricky because stone does not bend. It breaks under stress. And that's why the accomplishment of the Egyptians in carving, transporting, and erecting obelisk is so impressive. How easy is it to bend rock? The answer is it can't bend. It breaks. It is not uncommon to see rocks broken from geologic stresses. Rocks break in lots of directions, but it doesn't bend. Sometimes we see rocks in strata, broken in place. Is it possible for rock to bend? Well, it turns out yes. Rocks can bend under a combination of high pressure, high heat, and when that happens, it recrystallizes. So it can always be detected on examination. Sometimes geologic stresses bend the groups of rock strata, and they will show breaks in the rocks because rocks don't bend. Rocks are brittle. But there are examples of bent strata with no breaks at the bends, but also with no evidence of heat and recrystallization. Over 100 layers are shown here, none with erosion, all bent and deformed without cracking, which means that they were still soft when acted on as a whole. What cracks are there came after the bent whole became rock. This fits the flood model, followed by huge tectonic activity, exactly what many creationist scientists predict. Creationists typically believe in a timeline like this. We live about 2,000 years after Jesus. About 1,500 years before Jesus, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. The fall of Adam and Eve happened about 6,000 years ago. And about 4,500 years ago, we believe there was a global flood. In conjunction with the flood of Noah, most creationists believe that Pangea broke up, plate tectonics began, and that most mountains began to build rapidly. This was a catastrophic time. But no cracks at the bends. Why? Because these layers were bent while the layers were still wet. Geologic stresses have bent and folded the group strata here. Close examination shows that the cracks you see there happened after the bending, not during. You can see some random cracks in lots of directions, but not what you would see if the layers had been bent after they had become rock. This shows they were all folded while those layers were still wet mud. Mainstream geology claims that strata were made slowly over hundreds or thousands of years, but even they would have to admit that the noticeable layer with the wavy strata had to be made in a period of hours or days to hold that pattern, even if it is made of many smaller layers. Therefore, it was acted on while those layers were still soft. These layers were also bent while they were still soft, wet layers from the flood. Come closer and see. Even up close, we can see that it must have been soft when it was bent. Different example, hundreds of small layers, no extra cracking at the corners. This happens all over the world. even in the Grand Canyon. This is a bent strata called the Kaibab upward. Here is a geologist taking some samples to show you the size of it. So which is more credible? Some rock layers were bent with no signs of breaking or recrystallization, but they are still millions of years old when bent. Or some rock layers were bent with no signs of breaking or recrystallization because they were bent while they were wet layers, not rock. Back to the Grand Canyon. Now the climate is arid. Erosion happens slowly, but that's no guarantee of how it was in the past. We are told that it was all carved out hundreds of millions of years ago. But that may not have been the case. Most creationist scientists believe that it was accomplished in a very short time. Here's how. There is evidence of many giant lakes that existed not long after the flood. The two closest to the Grand Canyon together held more than 3,000 cubic miles of water. That's more than Lake Michigan today. Today, these places are just dry basins, but shortly after the flood, they were huge lakes. They were fed by several rivers until they rose above the edges of their rims, and they broke through, carving out the Grand Canyon in a relatively short time. Note the size of those lakes compared to the whole Grand Canyon, shown in yellow in the bottom left. We've been brainwashed by uniformitarian thinking to think that these things take a long time to happen. But the Grand Canyon was not a little water over a lot of time, but a lot of water in a little time. If it had been a little water over a lot of time, we should see lots of similar canyons all over the Southwest. And we don't. Only the evolutionist blind spot prevents them from seeing the obvious. So instead of being the showcase of mainstream geologic theory, to people who can think logically and are open to all of the evidence, the Grand Canyon is really a showcase of creation and the global flood. So which is more credible? The Grand Canyon formed slowly over hundreds of millions of years. The Grand Canyon formed quickly over a relatively short time. We are told that rock strata are created over hundreds or thousands of years. But is that the case? We've been brainwashed by the uniformitarian theory to think that these things take a long time to happen. It was thought in Darwin's days that rocks took hundreds or thousands of years to form. That concept is still popular. This meant that we would never have soft creatures preserved as fossils, and Charles Darwin said the very same thing. No organism wholly soft can be preserved. Anyone who has seen a living jellyfish washed up on the beach knows how short a time they last once they die. Yet numerous jellyfish fossils have been found. This means the process of making a fossil can be as short as a few days or even hours. In 1980, Mount St. Helens in Washington state erupted. 540 million tons of ash fell over an area more than 22,000 square miles. Note the person in the red shirt standing in the foreground. At Mount St. Helens, Washington, these rock layers formed in 3 hours on June 12, 1980. Note that the layers are all flat like the others we've seen all over the world. This whole new valley was carved out in 2 days. Note the flat layers just to the right of center. And volcanic ash from Mount St. Helens formed these layers, and then this canyon was created in 6 days. Which is more credible? Rock layers take a long time to form, hundreds or thousands of years. Or rock layers can be formed in weeks, months, or sometimes only in days. Scientists are supposed to be logical. So if you're trying to be logical and believe in evolution, don't let your belief get in the way of your logic. Evolution versus creationism, uniformitarianism, the belief that all processes have worked the way they do now, gradually over a long time instead of in compressed periods, or catastrophism, the belief that gradual processes have been interrupted by the effects of huge natural catastrophes. If evolutionists believe that there have been a minimum of 5 extinction events, then they really don't believe in uniformitarianism. It's pretty clear that they just don't want to admit the possibility of the global flood of Noah. Back to one of my original assertions, evolution and creation both are religious beliefs, but which one fits the data best? What we have just showed is that creation may fit the evidence better. There is a principle in psychology called cognitive dissonance. When a person holds a core belief so strong that when they are presented with new evidence that goes against that belief, it is not accepted because protecting the core belief is so important. They will rationalize, ignore, or deny anything that challenges the core belief. Evolutionary scientists have traditionally accused creationist scientists of this, but it's becoming increasingly obvious that it is the evolutionists who don't want to face the ever-increasing data because it doesn't sustain their theory. James Hutton and Charles Lyell laid the foundation of modern geology. They promoted the idea of the Earth being many millions or billions of years old. Charles Darwin built on top of their ideas to propose his Origin of the Species. At their time, very little scientific information was known compared to today. Since then, the science of geology has only considered an old Earth in all of its theorizing. On top of that concept, a very complicated house of cards has been built, which constitutes today's mainstream geologic timetable, which is built on the idea that the Earth is billions of years old. But too much information has been gathered that doesn't fit this idea. For instance, the 5 megasequences that show huge graded bedding as seen in the Grand Canyon, or the more likely scenario that the Grand Canyon was formed quickly rather than over many millions of years. Layers of rocks bent without cracking, indicating that they were bent while still soft. Or the idea that dinosaurs went extinct implies catastrophes in spite of geology proclaiming a belief in uniformitarianism. Continent-sized megasequences require continent-sized tsunamis. And Mount St. Helens rocks and canyons were created in days and weeks, not years, hundreds of years, and certainly not millions of years. And maybe the most glaring of all, strata in the Grand Canyon and all over the world show little or no evidence of erosion, in spite of being claimed to be hundreds of millions of years old. Now, any one of these facts should be enough to collapse the whole house of cards that constitutes mainstream geology's timeline of millions of years. So any logical conclusion would have to be that the only reason to believe in billions of years for the age of the Earth is based on belief, not science. All you're really left with is a collapsed house of cards. So here's a summary of what we've covered today. The idea that continents fit together was rejected until the 1960s. Plate tectonics is a new science. The concept of dinosaur extinction requires catastrophes. Multiple extinction events are accepted in geology. By definition, that's catastrophic. Megasequences cover near continental areas. They need continent-sized tsunamis to make them. Megasequences show graded bedding repeatedly, sandstone, shale, limestone. Multi-million-year Grand Canyon layers have no erosion at all, except the top layer. Strata all over the world show little or no erosion. This disproves millions of years. Bent rock layers without recrystallization shows that they were bent while still soft. The Grand Canyon was not made with a little water over a long time, but with lots of water over a little time. There should be lots of canyons like the Grand Canyon if it was made the way mainstream geology says it was. Rock layers and canyons at Mount St. Helens formed in days, not millions of years. And the geologic column is better explained by the continental flood deposits. And if the Earth isn't millions of years old, evolution can't have happened. The conclusion, the geologic record, does not reflect the evolutionary scenario. Instead, the geologic record reflects the creation and the flood of Noah. This is the third of our series of videos, and as we have seen, the data does not fit the evolutionary model, but it does fit the creation and flood model. The next time, we'll look at the origin of life. Thank you very much for joining me.